book of immigration law is about 1,000 pages thick. And so it's not an easy process. And when we talk about the immigration system in this country and why we're all passionately working on this project is because I think that even everybody in this room would recognize that the immigration system is broken in this country. The last time that the laws were revised on immigration was about 25 years ago. And generally speaking, that's been the history of this past century, that the laws need to be changed from time to time because they become antiquated and outdated and they're no longer working. Clearly, the laws that we have on the books right now are not working, is evidenced by the fact that we have about 12 million people that are here illegally right now. And any time when we have such a huge number of people that are here outside the law, it means that there's a fundamental problem somewhere. There's a disconnect, and I believe that there are several disconnects. And so when I talk about this four-legged stool, the first leg would be that we have to fix the legal immigration system, because the legal immigration system really does not work, which is what has led to the fact that we have so many undocumented people here. When you look to, they say, well, people should get in line or go to the end of the line when we're talking about immigration. Well, the problem is that there's not really a line for many of the people that are here illegally. In the world, the United States only allows about 10,000 workers to come here if they're not sponsored somehow. Say 5,000 or so could come from Mexico, which is the biggest contributor to the undocumented immigration problem that we have. More people come from Mexico than anywhere else. And it makes sense because they share such a huge border with us. And they are, there's the greatest disparity, I think, in the world between people that share a border in terms of income equality is between Mexico and the United States. If you can get in line, if you have somebody that will petition for you, a relative that will petition for you, and they would execute what's called an I-130 application to allow you to come to this country. If you do it legally, and you have somebody that will sponsor you, the wait time for Mexico is about 14 years to be reunited with your family members. From the Philippines, it's about 22 years. From Central America, it's somewhere in between. So if you want to get in line, there's an extremely long wait to be able to come if you can come. And so I think that we really need to take a look at, first of all, the structure of who we pick to come into this country. Is it best to have just family members? Should we put a little bit more effort into trying to decide who should come in terms of what we need in terms of workers, skilled workers, or whatever? So that process in and of itself is a huge undertaking to just restructure the actual laws that are on the books. And so that would be, I'd say, the first leg of the stool. The other leg of the stool, and Richard mentioned these, is I think we can all agree that as a sovereign nation, we have to be able to secure our border and determine who could come in here through the borders. And so I think that we are all in agreement that we do need to continue the process of securing our borders. Now, when President Clinton came into office, there were something like, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 border agents. Now there are over 21,000. So we've come a long way in securing the borders, but it's not fully secure, and I think that we just need to do it. We need to come together and find a way to get past that talking point of, well, first we have to secure the borders and then we could talk about everything else, which is what a lot of the politicians say. Let's do it. Let's find a way to secure the borders, and that's something that we can actually start to do right now. And so I'd like to talk about that today. The third stool would be when I'm having sort of a Rick Perry moment.
Oops.
Yeah, oops. Well, we have to talk about the fact, and this is really where a lot of the problem stems from, is that there's a magnet here, which is our economy, which right now is not very strong, but it's certainly a lot stronger than the economy in other countries such as Mexico. And so people would look to come here to work. And so we're talking about having some sort of a system in place, and we're talking about something called E-Verify, which would allow employers to determine if an employee is in fact here legally. And that is hugely important. We need to have some sort of a worksite enforcement where we could determine if someone is able to work, because that is really the magnet. And if our businesses were just not able to hire somebody that was here without documentation, then we really would go a long way towards solving this problem. There would still be an underground economy, and it would be very difficult to get rid of an underground economy, but we can mitigate that to the best we can by allowing the businesses and make it mandatory that all the businesses in this country have to determine if the person that they're hiring is here legally. But the fourth stool is the tricky stool. And that is, what do we do with the people that are here illegally? And there's 12 million of them, and I think there's broad agreement that we're just not going to deport all of these people. So what do we do with them? And I think that the idea of self-deportation, which some people are talking about, which is where you would implement the other things that I mentioned, but not do anything with these people, with the assumption that if they just can't find work, they would eventually leave, I think is very unbiblical. I think it's very cruel, because it's basically saying let's starve them out of the country. And I think that when we look at this issue with some level of compassion, we really can't treat people that way. So we have to come together and unite as a country and figure out really what we need to do to solve this problem and have a serious conversation about what we do with these 12 million people. Do we allow them to go onto a path to citizenship? Do we allow them just to go to a path to legal status? Do we deport them? What do we do with these people? All right, but as I said, comprehensive immigration reform, which is what I'm talking about, really is not imminent. It's not going to happen right now. What is happening right now are a couple of things, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that today. One thing that is happening is that the Supreme Court next week is going to hear oral arguments on the constitutionality of these state laws, and in particular they're going to be talking about the Arizona Senate Bill 1070. And I know this is a very difficult subject, and actually these laws are very popular, and I note that here in Florida you were not able to pass a similar law, but if in fact the Supreme Court does decide that the Arizona law is constitutional, then in very short order, within a year, you will see 21 to 23 states in this country pass similar laws to that Arizona law. And that's going to set up a patchwork quilt of states in this country that have separate immigration laws. And I believe that, the federal government does have certain responsibilities. Now, we as conservatives, we feel that very often the federal government intrudes into areas that they should not intrude into, and that there is certainly a massive bureaucracy in the federal government that is a very big economic problem and in many ways social problem for this country. But I believe that immigration is something that the federal government should be in charge of. We're citizens of the United States. We're not citizens of California or Florida or Alabama or Arizona. And so I would like to have a spirited argument or a conversation at least about this here today, about how we feel about these state laws. Because like I said, generally speaking, they are popular, but they're also very problematic. And I think that really the answer is comprehensive reform, which unfortunately is not going to come right now. And then the third thing that I hope we can talk about today, another well, anyway, let's see if we can have a conversation on those two things, and I'll move on and let Barrett talk.
Thank you, Robert. And our second guest is Dr. Barrett Duke, who is Vice President for Public Policy and head of our research division at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention, and has been working on this issue, and also has the added advantage of having a PhD in Hebrew and Hebraic studies, so he can tell us a lot about what the Old Testament has to say to us as Christians about the different kinds of strangers and how we treat strangers. We together wrote an article which appears in the Regent University Law Review, which you can get if you go to their website, which I think does lay out in exhaustive detail what a comprehensive immigration reform policy that would be fair and just looks like. Dr. Duke?
Thank you, Dr. Land. I'm glad to be able to have this time with you. Actually, I brought some copies of that article that you mentioned. They're on the back table there if you want to pick up one as you leave. It's titled Just Immigration Reform, Foundational Principles. This is in the Regent University Law Journal, and we're very glad it's in that journal, and we do believe that it does lay out very well our arguments, not only the components of just immigration reform, but a moral foundation for why those components are important. To me, the question for me was, how do I, as a Christian, relate to the question of immigration reform? I certainly could approach it as an offended citizen, and I could say, you know, this is just outrageous. These people have broken our laws. They've crossed our borders without permission. They're using false identification. A lot of people don't know about 40% of the people here illegally have overstayed their visas. It isn't as though they all crossed the border from Mexico. The problem is much more complex than that. And quite frankly, I'm more aggravated at the people who overstayed their visas because they actually basically signed a contract and made a commitment to be here a certain amount of time, and then they would leave, and they decided even to violate that. So it's a very complex question to me. And if I were just to think about it as simply from a law and order perspective, as an offended citizen, I would take one approach. But I'm not a United States citizen first. I'm a Christian first. Amen. And I'm supposed to think about how I want my government to treat the people in its borders from my own moral perspective, not to have somebody else lay their moral perspective off on me, not for me to basically, you know, put my finger to the wind and figure out, you know, where the hottest wind is blowing from, but instead to ask myself, what is the Christian response to the fact that we have 12 million people here in this country who actually, for whom we made it pretty easy for them to be here illegally. So I said, okay, I started, you know, since we're on this side of the cross, I said, okay, let me think about the New Testament. Where do I go in the New Testament that would give me some Bible passages that I could work with that would apply appropriately in this circumstance? And obviously, you know, you have passages about loving your neighbor and you know, the love of Christ, and you have those standard passages, but it worked within a different context than the context that we're working with here. So I thought, well, what else do I have to work with? And then I thought, well, let me think about the Old Testament, and then you know, finally the light came on, and I said, you know, Israel was a nation founded by God that had its own borders, had a common language, had its own laws, had its own legal system, had its own economy. Israel was pretty much like the United States, like any other nation from that perspective. So how did Israel treat the foreigner in its midst? That sent me on, and thank you, Dr. Lamb, for pointing out the fact that I do have a PhD in biblical interpretation, and it was the degree I emphasized, it was an emphasis in Old Testament. I did my dissertation in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I have the Hebrew background, and I was able to go to the original languages in the Old Testament. And I said, okay, how do I think through this then as a Christian who also recognizes that the Old Testament is the inspired Word of God as well? It's as equally inspired as the New Testament. The words that God says and the guidance that God gives in the Old Testament were the way God wanted his people to live. So I started this word study, and I came across this word stranger or alien or foreigner. I started tracing it through its use in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And continually, when God spoke about the foreigner or the stranger in Israel's midst, he said, love that person like yourself. Don't oppress that person. Don't do anything that is inappropriate behavior toward that person. Just because that person is there, that person is not an Israelite, person isn't a member of the faith of Israel, but they are living there. They're living there peaceably, and they're supposed to be treated just like anybody else in the nation. that was God telling his people in his nation, this is the nation that God founded, how to treat the foreigner in their midst. Well, then, I remembered this stuff from Ezra and Nehemiah, where the people had intermarried, and God actually broke up those marriages. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, how do I relate to that? Here's other foreigners intermarrying, and they're being told to break up these marriages. Well, fortunately, again, I know the biblical languages and was able to go to Ezra and Nehemiah. And the word that's used to refer to those folks in Ezra and Nehemiah is an entirely different Hebrew word than the word that's used in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so on. It's an entirely different word because God at that point with Ezra and Nehemiah is dealing with a different kind of foreigner in the midst of Israel. These folks were a legitimate threat to the religious nature of Israel and the cultural nature of Israel as God was trying to reestablish his people back in their land. It's an entirely different word. You cannot look at Ezra and Nehemiah and say, that's how God wants us to treat the foreigner and the stranger here. That was an entirely different circumstance. And then I thought, all right, now let me just take that one step further. These people were a threat in some particular ways. How do I think about that in terms of how the United States receives people from other countries? Well, we don't have a religious test for migration into this country. Nobody asks you if you have a religion or no religion as a basis of whether or not you get in. So you can't treat the people in this country differently simply because maybe their religion is different than yours. And you can't say, therefore, they don't get to come in. And we really don't have a cultural test. We don't say you have to do all these things the same way everybody else does them in order to come into this country. We do allow people to bring their culture into this country. Now, we do expect them to assimilate, but we don't tell them that they must or the ways in which that's going to be appropriate beyond a certain level. Like, we do believe you should learn to speak English. We think that's a pathway out of poverty, not just a good cultural component. But in terms of what God was dealing with Israel and Ezra and Nehemiah, those aren't even on the radar screen for us as we're thinking about immigration and immigration reform here in the United States. So for me, it really is, the foundational question is a moral one. How do I think through the way the person who is here illegally should be treated? And if I'm going to think through that as a Christian, it's pretty clear. I need to love these folks just like my own. I need to be affirming of these folks, and I need to find a way to make it possible for them to be able to live here in this country that they have chosen as their home, provided, that they're not breaking the laws, they're living among us peaceably. Let's welcome them. Let's affirm them. Let's make them part of this nation and grow together as one and continue to move this nation forward in the way that it has always moved forward, which is welcoming the stranger. So that's all in this document in the back, and I hope you'll pick that up. And I probably gave you all kinds of questions in your minds, and be happy to answer those afterward.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Duke. And I think it's very important for us to make those distinctions and to point out that the Bible does give us a pathway, a guide to how we deal with this issue. And one of the points that hasn't been made yet is that at least not fully, Robert was talking about the fact that many of the people have been here many years. Many of the children were brought here when they were very young, and they have no memory even of their native land. They may not even speak the language of their native land, and it would be absurd to ask them to be sent back to a country they don't know. We're going to now have Dr. Robert Campo and Carlos Campo. Sorry, Carlos, I know better than that. I shouldn't have looked at my notes. I saw Robert and then Campo, and it went from Gittleson to Campo. Carlos is doing a wonderful job as the president of Regent University. If you have not been to Regent University in the last 3 or 4 years, make an opportunity to go. It is an exciting place to be, with an exciting international student body of vibrant Christians who are preparing to serve the kingdom of Christ throughout the world. And Dr. Campo has brought a tremendous sense of excitement there. I've seldom been as excited having been on a campus than when I was with you.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Richard. Appreciate it. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well for your comments, and thank you for coming. I know that Richard said that he misspoke when he said my name, but he did that purposely, because he was trying to make the distinction to make it clear that I am, obviously, with my name, with a name like Carlos Campo, I am set apart from the other gentlemen here because it seems as though I am the only Hispanic or Latino on the panel. And lots of folks who are very honest with me say, well, it's clear why you would have an interest in immigration reform. These are your brothers. These are your sisters. You're one of them. You're biased already simply because of who you are and where you come from. And of course, what it brings up is our preconception of how Hispanics think about this issue. And I will tell you that lots of Cuban Americans, there's a continuum of feeling, of course, about this issue. So if you go just to the Hispanic community, what you would find is that lots of Cuban Americans actually favor deportation above any other remedy. Lots of them do. And again, I don't want to characterize the entire community, but what my point is that we cannot simply say because of someone's history, right, or name that they have some sort of disposition regarding this issue. This does become very personal. It does become very personal. I am Carlos Campo. I was born in Miami. My father was from Cuba. I've never been. People tell me, well, if you've been to Miami, you've been to Cuba, brother. Come on. Don't tell me you've never been to Cuba. It's just a suburb of Cuba, isn't it? I mean, Miami really, so I don't think that's totally true. And I spent lots of years in Nevada, where I lived in Las Vegas. I say that. I heard Robert say he was from Los Angeles. I don't know where that is. Did he mean Los Angeles? Is that where he's from? Now I've got it. See, there were a few Spaniards walking across this land. And if you go to the website for the state of Nevada, it's the only state, I think, in the Union that has a pronunciation guide for the state. And it does. It has a pronunciation guide for how one should pronounce the name of that state. And I frankly believe that this is tied to the issue. I do. It's tied to the way Nevadans think about their state and their reputation. And when George Bush, then president, spoke and said, Nevada, I'm in Nevada, literally there was a gasp in the crowd. And he was excoriated for mispronouncing the name. To me, there's something deep when you have that separates us, when you have such a tie to the pronunciation of your state. Is it because again, I wouldn't be such a pedant as to say, we must go around saying Los Angeles. I mean, it sounds crazy. Where does this end? But let's remember that names are important. They are, and I know for me, this issue came full circle when I sat in classrooms. Of all things, I'm an English teacher. Exactly, that's what my students thought. Dr. Campo, aren't you the Spanish teacher? I think you're in the wrong room. You've got to go down the hallway. We have a great school of psychology at Regent University, these wonderful PhDs who think too often and too long and too much. And and they tell me, well, you realize why you got into that field. You got into that field because your father, this was my father, God rest his soul, he died about 3 months ago. We miss him dearly at 91 years young. He used to say this, I cannot believe that my son, Carlos, he teaches English and I cannot speak English. You could see the pride in his heart. When I got that PhD and I wore that funky hood, that pride, my son is a doctor of English, and here I am, a Cuban man, I cannot speak English, and he is the professor of English. I can't believe it. And my PhDs in psychology said, well, you realize you got into that field because there was something deep within you that wanted command of that language that your father never fully did, and you didn't want to be teased in the fashion that he was. And would you please just go back to your classroom and leave me alone? But it was sitting in these English classes where, I'm in Las Vegas, and there are a lot of Latinos there, but there is just a disproportionate amount of Latinos in my classes. And I'm thinking, why are you here? Why so many Latinos in my class? Because I'd look out in the quad and see a lot less Latinos, but not in my classes. In my English classes, all these Latinos. So, of course, I talked to my students and I asked them, why did you sign up for this English class? And they said this, it was your name. We saw your name. It said Campo in the catalog. And we thought maybe you understood something about our struggle. Maybe you understood that, this is a tough language for me. It is. And I agree when we talk about assimilation, that English is a critical piece. You know, I tell my students, you work hard at your English. Don't worry so much about the accent. I love the accent. I love my father's accent. It was wonderful. But work hard and work hard at the language piece. That's a critical piece. But assimilation, you know, this whole idea of assimilation, we talk about a melting pot, but a lot of Latinos and others, not just Latinos, would say, you know, a melting pot can burn off some important things. You know, and I know it's very politically correct to say, well, we prefer a tossed salad metaphor to a melting pot metaphor, but I think there's something to be said for that. You know, this is a wonderful mix that we have in the United States. And you know, now that we have Richard moderating, I can steal his material. You know, it's Richard that says things like this, because this is one of the things that I think everyone on this panel understands. Folks, we did make it very easy for these people to come. And it's not just Mexicans who are here, of course, but so many came across because they did see two conflicting signs, one that said help wanted and the other that said no trespassing. That's Richard's line. You know, as Richard has said elsewhere, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, I've been driving down a stretch of highway for 20 years and I, you know, go 72 and it's 55 and I've done it a million times and I shouldn't. I'm a godly man. I shouldn't go 72. I should go 62. No, I should. That's the Christian way. 7 miles an hour. You don't get the ticket. Oh, let's pray right now. I mean, we need help. You know, and then all of a sudden, can you imagine if I got a note from the state saying you've got 485 violations? We just found out. We just realized. We knew it all along, but you know what? It's become apparent that we can't do this any longer. So you have 485 violations. You know, I paid 49 cents a pound for strawberries for a long time. And part of the reason I did that was because mi hermano Jesus and Ramon, they were picking strawberries for nothing, you know, for $10 a day. And so I paid 49 cents and didn't think twice about it. So we are culpable at some level. We didn't just look the other way, folks. If you think we just looked the other way, we encourage folks to come across this border. And we know today that a third of the folks who are here don't want to be citizens. They're not even concerned about legal status. They want to work. Give them work permits and they'd be happy. I'm going to close by talking about this continuum one more time because I know that's the heart that the Lord has given me for this issue. I, for 18 years, was part of education people would call secular. I would call maybe pluralistic. And it was not just the bastion of Satan, as lots of folks purport it to be. The truth is, there are a lot of Christian missionaries in education in America, in secular education in America. And that was my role, that was my life. But I've been to La Raza meetings. I have. Doesn't make me a La Razaist, you know. I went to those meetings because I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to hear what they had to say. And you know what the most radical people who are Latinos and others say about this issue? They say, this is their land. You moved the border. I was here and have been. My family's been here for years and years, way before any white people got here. We've been here for generations. You moved our border. And so you go home. Don't tell me to go. I'm talking about the most radical on this continuum. Richard knows this. They say, you go home. Don't call me a wetback. I just crossed a little river. You crossed a big ocean. You're the wetback. Right? So there's the most radical side. And on the farthest radical side, I can't even repeat what the other radical side says. Turn on AM radio almost anywhere in America, and you'll hear some people just this vituperation that has to desist, and people calling themselves Christians, and then referring to Hispanics as though they were mongrels or animals. You know, I had to go to Africa to hear a saying that struck home with me. Here's an ancient African proverb that says, you know, from very far away you look to me to be a monster. And as you get closer, I see that you're probably an animal. Closer still, and I realize you're a human being. But when I can feel your breath upon me, I know that you are my brother. And to me, when I was in those classrooms and I saw those students, they weren't just some group any longer. This was Maria. And she came to me with tears in her eyes as she talked about the fact that not only her mother, but her mother's mother and her mother's 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 mother had been maids. But her mother worked 4 jobs, literally around the clock, so that she could be here in a community college and sit in this English class. And the stakes for her were higher than almost anyone else in that class. And I thought to myself, would you call this girl a mongrel if you saw her, if you knew what an American she was when she pledged allegiance? She came from a country that had no civil rights, no civil rights. And she's come to the only country she knows, the only country she knows. And so the Lord said to me, Stop the vitriol. Get your voice out there. Be a part of the conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
I've got to tell this story. Dr. Duke and I, Dr. Duke was a student of mine at Criswell College many years ago, and we had a professor there named Luis Pantoja. And he was from the Philippines. And in the Philippines, they speak Spanish because that was a Spanish colony at one time. And I remember we had Andrew Navarro was one of our Mexican-American students, and he was asked about his experience at Criswell College, and he said, well, my biggest disappointment was discovering that Luis Pantoja wasn't Mexican, that he was Filipino. We are a unique country. I think most of us would agree with that for lots of reasons. But one way in which we are a unique country is we're the only nation that is a creedal nation. I guess that I could probably, if I lost my mind or had a lobotomy or something, I could go through the legal processes and I could become a citizen of France. That wouldn't make me a Frenchman. I could become a citizen of Great Britain. That wouldn't make me English. Anybody can become an American. From all of our we have a lot of different ethnicities in this room. No matter when our family came here, my family came early, and by the way, if your family came before Ellis Island, you're in the minority. Right. The majority of Americans today can trace their ancestry through Ellis Island. So if you're like me and your father's family came to Virginia Beach in 1636 and your mother's family came to Boston in 1650, you're a minority. But anybody can come here and pledge allegiance to our secular creed, which is embodied in the Declaration of Independence, and can become an American in a way that you cannot become German, you cannot become Chinese, you cannot become French. That makes us unique. And I can tell you from having lived for 3 years in the United Kingdom, I lived for 3 years in Oxford when I was doing my PhD, the vast majority of the people in the world would love to live in the United Kingdom. And it's a nice place, but it's boring. The food is boring. Compared to the United States, it's a boring place. And the reason is it has not had woven into the fabric of its culture all of the things that our different waves of immigration have brought to America. I mean, I think about every ethnic group that has come to this country has contributed to our culture, to our language, to our cuisine, to our music. Jazz. Jazz is an American form of music, and it's African. It comes from Africa. If you like Southern cooking, chicken fried steak and all that, that's all from Africa because the slaves did the cooking. And so fried chicken and milk gravy and all that good stuff, that's from Africa. And all of those things together, we have this wonderful place where you can be proud of being a Hispanic American or an African American or a Italian American. I mean, the Italians have Columbus Day. They have parades for Polish Americans, and even Anglo Americans are proud of their heritage. I had a reporter said, "How do Anglo Americans do that?" And I said, "Have you never been to a Daughters of the American Revolution?" I wouldn't say they celebrate at the Daughters of the American Revolution, but they do commemorate at the Daughters of the American Revolution their heritage. But we are bound together by a common allegiance to a set of values and beliefs that are laid out in the Declaration of Independence, and we are bound together by a common language. And that is terribly, terribly important in any immigration reform, that we have a commitment to having a common language. And I find that as I go around the country, that is one of the big emotional issues. People do not want to have at the World Series, have the national anthem sung in English and Spanish the way it has to be sung in French and English in Canada. And when you stop and think about it, there's no place in the world where a country does not have a common language that is a peaceful country. Ask the Canadians. The chief source of friction in Canada is linguistic. The chief source of friction in Belgium is between the Flemish who speak Dutch and they're Flemish, and the Belgians who speak French. So we do need that common, if immigrants want to come here, or if they want to stay here, and they want to become citizens, they need to learn to read, write, and speak English. Now, I find that immigrants don't have a problem with that. The only people who have a problem with it are liberals who have never gotten beyond the faculty lounge and who are politically correct. Because the immigrants understand that if you're going to live the American dream, you're going to learn to speak standard English. That's the way you learn. That's the way you achieve the American dream. But I personally think that we're closer to comprehensive immigration reform than we know. I think the country is far more ready for this than our leaders are. There was a Pew poll that was done this year that shows that 70% of Americans would be more likely to vote for someone who had a comprehensive immigration reform package that secured the border, secured the workplace, and found a pathway to legal status for the undocumented who are here. Now, the problem is that the vast majority of that 70% are in the middle, among the independents, who don't vote in primaries. So we haven't seen much about this in the primaries, or we've seen a lot of the wrong things. I must tell you, I was depressed and angered by the response that Rick Perry got at the debate when he was defending the in-state tuition for the children of undocumented workers in Texas. As a Texan, I can tell you it's virtually impossible to get all but 4 legislators to agree on anything. All but 4 legislators voted for that because it was good for Texas, it was good for those children, and it was good for the economy. Those children did not bring themselves here. They are innocent bystanders. They are innocent victims. And for them to be charged out-of-state tuition would condemn them to the margins of our society and would waste a precious national resource. And Governor Perry might not have been able to remember all of his points, but he was right on that, and we need to listen to him. So, any questions you want to direct to any of our panelists? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I got lots of them. But I'll ask this one. What is so wrong with the Arizona law? I mean, why is the government, is that unprecedented, suing its own state, and why is it so wrong? I don't understand.
I will let one of the other panelists answer that question. And I'm not trying to dodge the question, but Dr. Duke and I work for the Southern Baptist Convention, and we have a gentleman's agreement with the state conventions. We don't talk about state laws, and they don't talk about national laws. But we've got 2 fellows here who don't work for the Southern Baptist Convention.
Well, I'll take a whack at it. That the state law in Arizona, and they're very clear and upfront about it, is that they are promoting what they call attrition through enforcement. They have put these state laws together. Their law is designed to weed out all of the undocumented people out of that state. Now, they're not going to deport back to Mexico or Central America or wherever they're from. They're going to just go to another state, which basically kicks the can down the road and makes it somebody else's problem. And it goes back to something that I mentioned before. Now, a state does have, the ability to make many laws, and I think that, as I was saying, as conservatives, we believe that the states have the ability to do many things that the federal government shouldn't be doing. But in this particular case, the federal government, by Constitution, is the entity that is supposed to handle immigration law. And by states taking it into their own hands specifically for the purpose of making the undocumented people leave their state, I think is very problematic. And also I go back to the moral issue of starving somebody out of the country. They have adopted a statewide E-Verify system where all of the businesses in Arizona have to determine if somebody's legal to work there. And if they're not a legal citizen, then they can't work. And, you know, when a family can't afford food, when they can't afford rent, when they can't afford clothes, then of course they're going to have to leave. But I think that's a very cruel thing to do because, as we had mentioned here before, these people came, most of them, well over a decade ago. They came really at our behest. We needed their work. And so we turned a blind eye to allow them to come across the border or however they came or wherever they stayed to work. We needed people to pick our strawberries and our lettuce and clean up and make our beds and mow our lawns. And yeah, some of those jobs could go to Americans, but let's be honest with each other. And I put my businessman's hat on because I come from a business background. We're not going to be able, as a country, to simply just find replacement workers for these 7 million people that are employed and are undocumented in this country. We're not going to find 7 million people that are willing to work 10 hours in the hot sun picking lettuce. It's just not going to happen. And so, you know, and again, it goes back to the moral issue that we're talking about. It's just not right. We have to come together in a compassionate way and say, okay, look, we're a nation of laws. We have to have laws. Let's fundamentally restructure the laws to make them right, to make them work, to make them fair. But let's try and have some compassion for the people that we've allowed to stay here illegally. I mean, if as conservatives we're for personal responsibility, and we believe in personal responsibility, and I do very much, I think that we as a nation have to take some personal responsibility. Even if we're just 1% responsible for allowing these people to stay in, let's face facts that we're way more than 1% responsible for the fact that we have these people here, then I think that we owe it to everybody and to these people that we allowed to come here and stay and build a life here. And they're mostly, I mean, there are some bad apples. And if we do what we're talking about, a comprehensive immigration reform, we're going to be able to weed out the bad apples. They're not going to be able to qualify because you have to clear a criminal background check, both state and federal. But for the good people that are family-oriented, God-loving people that come here to work and they work hard for our worst jobs at our worst pay, I think that we have to show some compassion for them. And so that's why I think that fundamentally, I could sympathize with the people that are so frustrated in the states like Alabama and Arizona that the federal government hasn't acted. They've taken it upon themselves to do so. And I understand that in a vacuum, something's going to happen. And we have a vacuum right now. We have to work on filling that vacuum on a federal level. And that's why I have a problem with the state laws.
Carlos?
I would just add quickly that I agree that Arizona was a cry for help. You know, I don't think there's whole lot wrong with that action. You know, the federal government wouldn't act, and they felt they had to, and I agree with that. And I think it's in practice. How practical is the Arizona law? I don't think it's very practical, and there is an element of profiling that's inherent in the law. It's almost impossible not to profile, and you see what the law enforcement folks have already said in response to the law. There's some deep concerns there. And I think more than anything for me, it's not a comprehensive solution, and that's, to me, what's most problematic about it.
How many of you remember the Elian Gonzalez case? The Elian Gonzalez case. Now, I'm not a guy who gets premonitions very often, but I awoke out of a dead sleep in the middle of the night, and I had this horrible premonition. Never had that experience before in my life. And I turned on the television set just in time to see the raid on Elian Gonzalez's relative's house here in Florida, and saw American authorities forcibly drag that little boy out of his house, out of his relative's house, that his mother died to bring him to freedom, to send him back to communist Cuba, where he's now, I don't know if you saw his picture the other day, he's now 15, and he's the president of his Young Communist League local chapter. When I saw, I was so upset, I went in the bathroom and threw up. There are hundreds of thousands of Elian Gonzalez's out there that have been brought here by their parents and have grown up in the United States. This is the only country they know. And we are not going to deport those people. We're not. We shouldn't. We're not. There's not the political will to do it. And right now, they're in the margins. They're at the margins of society where they are vulnerable to unscrupulous people that prey upon them because they know they can't seek the protection of the law. And there's a reason why there are tens of thousands of Hispanic girls who are in sexual slavery in the United States. As I speak to you, there are probably 40,000 young women, girls, who are in sexual slavery, literally. They are being held in involuntary servitude to sexually service men who have been addicted to sex through pornography. You know, pornography creates the market and sex slavery fills it. And if we had an immigration system that worked, we would be able to get at that problem as well much easier than we do now. Other questions? Yes, ma'am, the lady in green.
To me, one of the things that framing the problem and rather than going to make the problem. So you have talking that can target compassion, the legal. Now, I'm the drive. My daughter works based on pediatrics. Almost all of her patients are unable. I have friends who have worked in the construction who've lost their jobs in Florida because Mexico taking their jobs and they're probably hard workers. So those are two situations practically that hurt us, and yet I can't agree with compassion. We have to have, so my question really is, if we have talking points that we frame as conservatives that address those issues.
He's got these talking points in his back pocket, so this is his stump speech.
By we, if you mean the Republicans, no. The Republican Party during the primaries, the Republican Party has painted itself into a corner and then, having surveyed the damage, applied a second coat. That's why many people think that Marco Rubio is the best possible person that Mr. Romney could pick as his running mate, because Senator Rubio has come out in support of a conservative DREAM Act that would be a first step in the right direction toward improving what is a dismal and, in my opinion, a dismal and indefensible policy by the Republican Party and by the Republican candidates. The DREAM Act, we should all be for a conservative, clean DREAM Act. These people didn't break the law. These people are victims. They are children who were brought here at a young age by parents who were undocumented. We don't want to let them graduate from our high schools. When some of them are valedictorians. We don't want to let them graduate from our colleges. We don't want to let them have in-state tuition. These young people are a natural resource.
Right.
We should be doing everything we can to invest in them and to make them productive participants in our society. The other part of the DREAM Act would say, if you serve in the military, you earn your way to full legal status. I say anybody who's willing to put on the uniform of the armed services of the United States and put themselves in harm's way to defend our freedom has earned the right to enjoy that freedom. This is, to me, the opposition to the DREAM. Now, we had to oppose the last DREAM Act because Senator Reid tried to mess it up at the end by in what practically turned into backdoor amnesty. But Senator Rubio has proposed a clean, straightforward DREAM Act that would begin to address this and show some goodwill on the part of conservatives toward the Hispanic community, which is desperately needed. Mr. Bush got the majority of the Hispanic vote when he ran for governor of Texas. And he got, 35% of the Hispanic vote? 44% the second time around. And he ran in 2000. George W. Bush, part of his platform was comprehensive immigration reform, and then it got sidelined by 9/11. Anybody else want to add to that?
Let me just encourage you to pick up a copy of the paper that I brought along. The last section of it, starting from what's page 87, because this is just copied out of the journal, actually identifies our position on what would be appropriate components for just immigration reform, and it has the arguments for why each of those components is important. So if you were to get that and read this, here's A, secure borders, and then B, paths to legal status. I mean, you can just basically create your own talking points from that right down through the end, and also have just some very basic couple paragraphs that explains the importance of each of those as well. So if you take this, I think it will give you what you're looking for.
The one other aspect of this that would be a talking point is that there have been studies done that show that if we had a way for undocumented workers to become documented and to pay a fine and to begin to work toward full legal status so that they had the protections of the law, that the wages of all American workers at the lowest level would rise by about 12%. Now, that's a lot of money to people who are at the base level. A 12% increase in wages makes a big difference in what gets put on the dinner table. And it would almost immediately happen because wages, they estimate wages are being suppressed by about 12% by unscrupulous employers hiring undocumented who are willing to work for less money because they're undocumented and don't have access to the protections of the law. Yes, sir.
I was wondering, I can see what some of the components be of comprehensive reform. One component being finding a legal path the young people brought here and are enrolled in, so they're you said they're innocent. What are some of the other components? What would a comprehensive reform?
Well, Dr. Duke has given us an outline that's written as you can have it. I'll just give you an oral one quickly. You would take part of that fine that if they have an opportunity to come forward and register and undergo a background check to make certain that they're not, criminals. And then if they pass that, they pay a fine. Part of that fine would be used to give them a tamper-proof identity card, probably a thumbprint. I think most of us would resist a picture, but a thumbprint. And so then you could say to the employers, if they don't have one of these cards, then if you hire them, you're going to face a stiff fine or maybe even a prison sentence. That secures the workplace. If they can't get a job when they get here, they won't come. So that'll cut the flow at the border by 90%. Well, if we do that, we can catch the other 10% that are coming over for nefarious purposes because we'll be looking for 10% instead of 100, a much larger number. Then we would have a sort of a sliding scale where if they've been here 20 years, they would have to do 3 years of probation, and then they would get full legal status. Notice I didn't say citizenship. I said full legal status. Then if they've been here 5 years, they probably have to go 5 to 6, 7 years of probation before they can get full legal status. And that means they keep their job, they pay their bills, they pay their taxes, and they stay out of trouble. Then they can move to full legal status. And they would also have to learn to read if they want to stay here. And as Carlos has said, we have estimates that 30 to 35% really don't want to stay here. They want to come here, make money, and go back home to Mexico and open a garage. A lot of them want to go back to Mexico for the same reason that a lot of our Social Security recipients have moved to Mexico. The dollar goes a lot farther in Mexico than it does in the United States. Then they would have to learn to read, write, and speak English if they want to stay here, and they have to pass a test that they've learned to read, write, and speak English. Then we would have as a secondary thing, we would have a new immigration policy whereby we would have a guest worker program so that, for instance, if an employer offers a job for a month in the newspapers or online and no American fills it, we can go to a pre-approved pool of guest workers who could be brought in to work at that job for a specified period of time, for 3 years or 4 years, and then would have to either reapply or the employer would have to reopen that job. We're facing a labor shortage in the United States because we've killed 53 million babies. We have a labor shortage. I mean, and you talk about Americans won't do the jobs at the price that the economy will sustain. Remember the meat packing plant in Iowa, where they went in and raided and took out all the Hispanics? You know who's doing the job now? Somalis. They couldn't find Americans who would do it. You ever been to a meat packing plant? Most folks would rather collect unemployment.
Pick up.
It sounds simple, so why can't, what is the big obstacle to our legislators? Is it some level of hatred that bubbles up and puts fear in them?
No,
Politics.
it's politics.
No, it's politics.
Both sides, both parties are playing politics with the issue.
What needs to happen is we need a groundswell at the grassroots level that begins to put pressure on our legislators to resolve the problem. Right now, the special interests are the one making the noise. Most of the people in this country are not tuned into this enough so that they're communicating with their legislators that they want them to resolve this in a humane way, in a comprehensive way. And we aren't going to get that problem resolved in Washington until you and tens of thousands like you begin to demand it. And that's what needs to take place next.
Take somebody from this side. Yes, sir.
My name is Chris Vesper from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and now Florida. I've been thinking of this for quite a few years. We have, which I want to address that one man, in the Bible it says, Caesar. What did Caesar do? He made Mary and Joseph go to register. So this is what I'm saying we should do with these illegals. We have a lot of these things in place now, and there's no reason why we cannot identify them and seal our borders both at the same time. We have, which we did in World War II, the draft. What did we do? We have the federal post offices already in place in every town. These people, if they came illegally, sorry about my voice. Sure. These people, if they came illegally, should be able to go to the federal post office and register, just like we did during the war. And they should have Spanish speaking, or a person there who can speak multi-languages that can register these people on the computer. Those particular people then, once they register, could be given a card like you talked about for work purposes. And those particular people then, as long as they didn't get in trouble for 4 or 5 years, then could go move to the next step for legalization and for speaking English. Some of these things are already in place. If the politicians and people like yourselves, who are right close to them, can put pressure on them to get this stuff done. It's been talked about for years, and we did nothing about it. It should be done. Some of this stuff is in place. Let's spend the money to get it done and get it done right.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir, and well said. Most of the mechanism is there to address this very quickly. Right now, of course, you know, those folks won't come forward because they figure all they're doing is putting targets, deportation targets on themselves. So they don't feel like they can come out of the shadows at this point. We need some kind of way for them to feel like they're not, a trick isn't going to be played on them if they come forward. And the only way we're going to do that is to actually have legislation that guarantees them when they come forward and identify themselves, they will be put in a system that enables them to stay.
Well, right now, of course, right now, the president said he's not even going to enforce the laws. Well, right now, the president has said he's not going to enforce the laws that are in place. If they catch people who are here illegally, unless they have a criminal record, they're going to let them loose. This brings me to a much more important point. This to me, this is more important than anything else that I'm going to say this morning. We are sitting in one of the 3 or 4 countries in the world, and it's only 3 or 4, where the 2000 presidential election would have been settled as peacefully as it was. We have something in the United States called the rule of law. We respect the rule of law. Alcohol consumption went down drastically during Prohibition. Most American citizens, when it became illegal, they quit drinking because it was the law. About 25% of Americans don't think that George W. Bush won the 2000 election. But when the Supreme Court said 7-2 that Florida couldn't count votes the way they were counting them, with different standards in different counties, and 5-4 that the time was over that the Electoral College was meeting. They accepted the results. They accepted the rule of law. For 30 or more years now, the American government has not been enforcing its own laws on immigration. This breeds disrespect for the rule of law. And the rule of law is a very fragile thing. Now, we tend to take it for granted in the United States because for most of our history, it's been part of the furniture in the room. But it is a very fragile thing. And we just cannot allow the government to just ignore its own laws. If they have laws that they don't think are enforceable, then we need to change the laws, not just ignore them. And I'm concerned about the way we have failed to deal with the immigration issue is undermining Americans' respect for the rule of law. And that is a dangerous thing, because if we lose respect for the rule of law, we've lost a very precious and a very hard-won thing.
Right. And I would just want to reinforce the point we made, just to use the example that the gentleman gave about folks going to the post office to register for the draft. Think of how different...
Which we did.
All right. All right. Which you did. And again, different wars, think of the response even in different wars in America to that action, right? And how some Americans thought that they would flee to another country to avoid that draft. And Richard has spoken publicly about his disdain for those folks and how they've been allowed to be granted amnesty in ways that are anathema to us. But I want to reinforce the fact that the toughest part of this plan that we've outlined is that one, that these folks are not only putting a target on their back to say, deport me now when they come forward, but they are so ingrained to understand that government equals corruption. It equals corruption. So you're telling me that the government is here to help me, and they've asked me to come out of the shadows because they're going to make it better for me? No un chance en el mundo. There's not a chance in this world that I'm coming out of the shadows for that. So I think it's incumbent upon, frankly, Hispanic leaders to be standing at the forefront to say that it is safe and ensure that.
If you gave them a program that would ensure that they would not be, that they would only be held accountable for their living.
I'm with you.
And not for anything else. If you gave them a program,
right,
a real honest program, there's no reason why they couldn't. And no reason why they wouldn't if it was to their benefit.
It'll take some leadership on the part, I think, of the Hispanic community, because remember, these folks came here because they didn't have it so good where they were. And one of the reasons they didn't have it so good where they were is because of corrupt government. So they're not used to government telling the truth.
Right.
They're not used to government obeying its own laws. And so it's going to take some time to get them to trust the government. When you came forward and registered for the draft, when I came forward and registered for the draft, we had reason to believe that the government was going to treat us fairly, that the government was going to draft us according to laws that were fair, and they weren't going to play favorites. That's not true in Mexico, I can tell you. I talked to businessmen who are Mexican citizens, and they do their business in the United States rather than in Mexico because they don't have to pay bribes and they don't have to deal with the corrupt government in the United States that they would have to deal with in Mexico. And those are people who have means. Those are people who are well up the totem pole economically.
And yes, sir, right now there is no legal protection for those folks. So we have to get legislation that protects them, and it's going to take you calling for that. I noticed that all of our papers are gone back there. But if you go on our website, just go on erlc.com. This is on our website, erlc.com. Go to the issues section on immigration, and you can download a copy of this for yourself. I'm sorry. I brought plenty of them. They're all gone. If you didn't get one.
We have run out of time.
And I have one here.
Thank y'all for coming.